The Cold War was an open yet restricted rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was an economic battle between capitalism and communism in Europe and the world. Back in 1917, when the First World War was still going on, Russia was pushing Germany out of its country. At this time, Lenin was the leader of Russia and made the country communist, thus making it known as the USSR. They created an internal crisis which overthrew the government. During this time, the United States, Britain, and Russia were still at peace with each other. Lenin ended up dying on January 21st, 1924, and Stalin took over his place. Stalin implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the USSR from an agriculture economy to an industrial one. The USSR wanted to spread its communism to other European countries, which caused the relationship between the old allies to start to deteriorate. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or for short NATO, was put in place in 1949, which included the countries of Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The establishment of NATO ensured the USSR that the West was going to try to destroy them. America announced the Truman Doctrine, which stated that they wanted to prevent communism from spreading around the world. Later, Berlin was split between West and East Berlin. In 1848 to 1849, America launched a Berlin airlift to help economically aid West Berlin. They suffered a Berlin blockade from the USSR when they blocked the Western Allies' railway, road, and canal access to the sectors of Berlin under Western control. Around this time, the USSR had developed its own atomic bomb, and if a major war broke out between the US and Russia, it would cause unbearable destruction. China was in a civil war since 1927, and they ended up becoming communist and joining the Soviet Union with a treaty. In 1952, Eisenhower became the President of the United States, and at the same time, Stalin died of cerebral hemorrhage. He was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who from 1956 would go on a campaign of de-Stalinization. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to have greater freedoms. Also at this time, a ton of revolutions were suppressed, including the East German Uprising, the Hungarian Revolution, and the Poznan protests in Poland. Khrushchev did allow some mild reforms in Poland, called the Polish Thaw. He permitted more cultural expression and then banned anything that went against what he wanted. Therefore, modern art, jazz music, poetry, and Western culture were banned. For a couple of years, America and the USSR were spying on each other. NATO was digging a tunnel under East Berlin to keep a check on the Soviet Union's communications. However, the Soviets knew about this because they had a spy to tell them. Overall, America had the edge in technology and espionage for spying. U-2 spy planes flew across Russia with surveillance cameras from the skies. When one of these planes was caught and shot down in 1916, it made Khrushchev very furious. There was a missile gap in the favor of the Soviet Union, meaning that they had a lot more missiles. Nikita Khrushchev was really confident because of this, which led to America building a technology exhibit. The name of this exhibit was the American National Exhibit in Moscow, which was built in 1959. When both sides of the Cold War upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, tension was starting to grow. The United States was the first to test their hydrogen bomb back on November 1, 1952. The Warsaw Pact was set up in response to West Germany joining NATO, and this pact maintained a balance of power in NATO. This strengthened the bond between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In response, America elected John F. Kennedy as president in 1960 because he would be tough on communism. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology really well, but this came at the cost of spending a lot of money. All the money went to the military and not to the people, and living conditions under communism were very hard to handle. Berlin was becoming a problem to the Soviet side. West Berlin was economically prosperous while East Berlin was struggling. Therefore, people from East Berlin decided to move to West Berlin in hopes of better living conditions. The United States were in West Berlin, and Khrushchev's plan was to threaten them to leave. If that didn't work out, which it didn't, he would build a wall separating West and East Berlin. Ever since August 13, 1961, Berliners were trying to escape over the wall, and hundreds would die trying to do so. Overall, the wall would show the growing failures of the communist system. The East Berlin Guard stopped letting US diplomats over, which got Kennedy mad. In October of 1961, the US started putting up tanks to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets repeated this, and the two superpowers were at a standoff for 16 hours. The world was preparing for a nuclear disaster. Then, the United States and USSR agreed to start moving their tanks away from each other, slowly doing so.
Later in the 1960s was a period of time that almost saw a nuclear war. There was an extreme division between cultures, major political assassinations, and the world had been bracing for a nuclear apocalypse. The Cuban government was overthrown by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. This was a cause of concern to America because they didn't want a communist country in their own territory. Therefore, the U.S. began to train Cuban exiles in an attempt to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. This was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, which turned out to be a massive failure. Back to the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of nuclear missiles, but those missiles were medium range and couldn't reach America. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. spy plane noticed that Cuba had Soviet missiles. This was very alarming to the United States because if Cuba decided to invade, a nuclear war would happen with the Soviet Union. So, the United States tried to stop this by putting up a blockade around Cuba, and the U.S. Navy would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any ship that didn't agree to their terms. The Soviet Union responded by getting their military ready and getting their missiles aimed directly at America. The U.S. did the same, and they started planning an attack on Cuba. It seemed at this point that World War III was about to happen.
And through this, the Cuba became to the Soviet Union the same as the West Berlin to the United States. Useless small piece of land, very deep inside hostile territory. But if you will not protect the small piece of land, you will lose your face. Your allies would not trust you. So we have to do it. So Khrushchev decided to send missiles there at the diplomatic signal. Don't invade Cuba, we are serious.
Khrushchev denied Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. For the first time ever, the U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. This meant that military forces would stand ready to deploy and fight in 6 hours or less. DEFCON 1 would mean nuclear war. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean thought that war was going on, so 2 of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire the nuclear torpedo. However, the 3rd senior officer refused to authorize this decision, which saved the United States from disaster. This whole situation was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it peaked on October 27, 1962. Kennedy agreed to not invade Cuba, call up the U.S. naval quarantine, and remove its missiles from Turkey, while Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba under the supervision of the United Nations and to not reintroduce them. The 2 sides had finally come to an agreement. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson took office. He inherited a developing crisis in the East, which was Vietnam. Before the assassination of Kennedy, the United States and the USSR agreed on a limited test ban treaty called the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. The Soviets got rid of Khrushchev, and they replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev. Nuclear war was becoming a possibility at this point, and the arms race, also known as the buildup of weapons, continued through the 60s and 70s. America had an advantage in nuclear arms, as it was more powerful than the Soviets. Anti-ballistic missiles and multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles were developed by the U.S. In the Broken Arrow incident, a U.S. bomber collided with a tanker midair, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It took 2.5 months until America found one of these bombs in the ocean. Since 1950, America had lost a nuclear bomb 14 times. French colonizers were removed from Vietnam, and the country was split into 2, with the North being communist and the South being anti-communist. The U.S. feared that communism was going to spread to South Vietnam and create a domino effect, meaning that if communism spread to South Vietnam, it could spread to other countries nearby. The President of the United States had to decide whether to lose South Vietnam or send in troops. He decided to send in troops in 1965, and the U.S. had to draft millions of Americans to fight a ruthless enemy who had a very strong defense. They didn't know who or where the enemy was, which caused the civilian population to get caught up in the brutal crossfire. Overall, the Vietnam War was a long and brutal war. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected as the next president of the United States. Since the Vietnam War was proving to be unwinnable, Nixon decided to bring all the troops back to America, and this ended the U.S. involvement in Vietnam in 1973. 2 years later, South Vietnam would fall. The Cold War was starting to affect both superpowers badly. Soviet people were poorer than people in the West. The USSR and the U.S. would need to reduce spending to save their economies. In 1972, a number of treaties were signed, which included the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement, and that same year, Nixon would resign from office because of the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford would replace him as president, and Jimmy Carter would be elected as president in 1976. Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev would meet again for another SALT agreement. Tension was going on, and the Soviet Union would put down attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. Between 1977 and 1982, the Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles. In the 1980s, the United States decided to elect someone that would be tough on communism, which was Ronald Reagan. In 1983, he wanted to continue the arms and space race, so he came up with the Space Defense Initiative, otherwise known as the SDI, which cost a lot of money.
The Soviet Union lost their relationship with China. Brezhnev became old and would die. Gorbachev would become the next Soviet leader in 1985. He thought that the Soviet system and economy wasn't doing well because the Soviet people couldn't find satisfaction in their work. He ended Soviet spending on the arms race to save the economy. The Iron Curtain, or the Berlin Wall, was removed on the Eastern Bloc. East Germans saw their chance to go to the west by heading to Hungary and then crossing the border to the west. On November 9, 1989, the travel ban between West and East Germany was lifted. In that same year, elections were finally held in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's attempt towards internal reform had weakened the Communist Party and allowed power to shift to Russia and other constituent republics of the Soviet Union. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 nations that were newly independent were born, including Russia with a democratically elected anti-communist leader. The Cold War had come to an end.